Welcome to Preface, our 24 news special series of interviews of the Algiers International Book Fair SILA 2025. I'm Marwa Belaiwer, and on the eve of the national commemoration of November 1st, the date that marks the beginning of the glorious Algerian Revolution, we are honored to welcome Professor Benjamin Claude Brouwer from the University of Texas at Austin. Professor Benjamin, thank you for joining us and welcome to Algiers.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, Professor Brouwer, November 1st stands as the foundation of Algeria's national identity and memory. So, from your historical perspective, how do your studies of colonial control and violence help explain what Algerians are rising against in 1954?
Sure, thank you for the question, and thank you for the invitation. It's a real honor to be here. The book fair is incredible, really stunning, all of the work that people have put into it, and just to see so many people come together to celebrate books, which is very inspiring for me.
Very pleased to have you with us, sir. Yeah.
The question of the 1st of November, you know, I teach this in my classes, and I invite my students in the United States to place themselves from the perspective of people at the time that we're studying. And the 1st of November is really such an amazing moment because there's a people are taking at the time personal risks, risk for their safety, risk for their lives, and there's so much riding on it. So you have a group of revolutionaries who have come together and decided that this is the moment, and sort of throw themselves into this revolution, into a war of national liberation that really, I think at the time that no one could have anticipated what the outcome would have been, you know. And so, these people who know what they're doing and they have a vision of what the goal of this revolution will be. But no one could have anticipated that it would take so long, that it would be so costly, that it would be so devastating. Now, when your question asks about history and the people who did this and know about the history that they're facing, they know what they're facing when they're going against this French colonial system, and the history that I know, that I researched in the archives and so forth, when I think about November 1st from the perspective of nearly 130 years of colonial occupation, of violence in physical form, violence in symbolic form, the sort of violence in which law works, the way that violence works upon the family, cultural institutions, language. It's really quite a stunning moment, the 1st of November 1954.
So in your work, In a Desert Named Peace, you show how France's so-called pacification of the Sahara was carried out through destruction and forced movement and domination. So how does this reveal the moral contradiction at the heart of the colonial life and the colonial rule, I say, and help us understand the depth of Algeria's resistance?
Sure. So the title itself, A Desert Named Peace, is a quotation from a Roman general, Tacitus, who wrote a very critical history of Roman imperialism in Britain at the time. And he is, the Desert Named Peace, he's talking, framing things critically to his readers, in which he's saying, look, okay, you as military men, you have come and pacified, this is the term, of course, that's important for French colonialism, pacification. You have pacified Britain, but what you've done is you're ruling over a land that's completely in ruins, a desert named peace, literally as it says. And so I thought this was very evocative because so much of what the way that French planners are approaching, the book deals with the conquest of the Sahara, what the French call the conquest of the Sahara. And at certain moments, they call this a peaceful penetration. Pénétration pacifique is the French term that they used. And it's so at odds with the actual facts of the way in which French power installs itself in the Sahara, which is upon a series of massacres, Zacha, Lagouat, and many others who don't have a name. Smaller oases, caravans that are ambushed and so forth that are part of this. And then there's a sort of way in which the way that that French artists and writers, they sort of engaged the Sahara in these sorts of tropes that we see through, quite frankly now this is the tropes of tourism, swaying palm trees, bubbling springs, beautiful dunes and so forth. But just on the horizon or just on the margin of all of this beauty of the desert is all of this destruction, all of this violence, all of this sadness for the people who live there.
And would you say that what happened in the Sahara anticipated the kind of determination that defined the 1954 revolution?
Oh, certainly. These are practices, what you see the French military and security forces wielding against the ALN, against the Algerian people after 1954. This doesn't come out of nowhere, right? This is a long tradition of torture, for example, wasn't invented in 1954 going forward. The torture, this sort of violence had been part and parcel of French colonialism, really since the beginning, since the beginning of the French army. And also I think it's important to remember that the French army had been doing this for a long time before they got to Algeria, right? They had done this in the Vendée in Western France. They had done this in trying to suppress the Haitian Revolution. They had done this in Spain. They had done this in Calabria in southern Italy. And so they're well polished when they come to Algeria. And so the term razzia that the French army uses and French writers are using throughout the 19th century to talk about what they think is a distinctive way of waging war in Africa. We have to wage war as the Africans do, as the Algerians do, and we don't even, this is the claim, it's a very false claim, but this is a claim, we don't even have a language, a word in our own military vocabulary to talk about this, right? We have to take an Arabic word because this is the way that they do things here, right? Which is entirely false, right? The French army had been doing razzia, if we understand razzia is what it is, a massacre. They've been practicing this, they're very, very honed in their skills well before they get to Algeria.
Sir, and also your upcoming book, The Colonization of Names, examines how colonial systems used language, maps and archives to control entire societies. How does this dynamic speak to Algeria's experience and to the post-independence effort to reclaim names, heritage and identity?
Certainly. So the first book is looking at violence in its physical aspects, right? The massacre would be one example of this. And as a historian, to read these accounts in the archives, it's difficult. Even many years after, hundreds of years later, to read this, you have paper, you can see the sort of suffering that comes through the words that we have in the archives. And so I was looking for something that was slightly different than that. And also I wanted to look at different forms of violence. Violence doesn't just exist in physical forms, right? And what I'm looking at is something that I conceptualize borrowing a body of thought from psychoanalysis, from French sociology, as symbolic violence, right? And in its core, symbolic violence is violence that can be waged through language. This is how I understand it. And language comes in many different languages. There's a language question, there's a cultural question that expresses itself in a colonial situation, always in terms of violence. And the particular part of language that I focused upon was personal names, right, which undergo drastic transformation at the hands of the French. Algerian personal names are, we might call this onomastic brutalism. That's a term that I use, and Algerian researchers who have been working about this talk about an omanacide, right? So they take the term cide from genocide, right? And they talk about this in terms of a killing that is imposed through the name, right? And the work that I do is a historical work, and it follows in the footsteps of many generations already of Algerian researchers, historians, geographers, and linguists who have been looking at ways to understand this omanacide that Algerians suffered under colonialism. And I think what I bring to the project is an ability to looking through the French archives. It's not always easy for Algerian researchers to get to the French archives, although these are part of their patrimoine. Many of these records are in France. And so I worked upon that, the work that I do as a historian, the work that I do as a critical theorist. also. And so, the end of the project is a study in which I do a couple of different things. I try to understand what names were before they were transformed by the French, the different processes of transformation that existed, the purposes to which these new names are used, and the most central part of this is the establishment of the État civil, a civil registry for Algerians, and which is a way, the civil registry, the État civil in the French tradition is a tool of emancipation, right? It's developed in its modern form during the French Revolution as a way to extract the citizen of the masses, an individual citizen endowed with rights. This is very, very important to the État civil in the French iteration of it. And in Algeria, this is not the case, obviously. There's only one modality of rights in any significant way to which Algerians have access, and this is the right of private property. And Algerians are endowed with this right through the État civil, but it's mainly a tool in which for a land transfer, right? To open a marketplace. French marketplaces in Anne needs titles, written titles, and they need names that don't change. And names, most importantly, that the French can understand, right? That are fixed, that are written in French letters in the French alphabet, and have the two-part modern standard names that were developed again during the French Revolution. And you need this on a property title. Someone has the right of private property. The idea is that as an individual, extract them not as a citizen, but as a landowner who will then sell that land, right? Extract it from the family and the traditions of collective exploitation of land that had long been in place, which brings people together, right, as a sort of cohesive force. And the name individuates people, right? And allows them, in some cases, to act egotistically, right? To buy up lands, to sell lands. In any case, from the French perspective, the idea is all of this land will come into European hands, into the hands of European settlers. And this is one of the main focuses of this. And this is one part of it, but also I think, and this is what is felt, I think, today, many people in Algeria today, and this is one of the things that inspires my work, are trying to really, since 1954 and certainly after independence in 1962, trying to understand what it means to be an Algerian. Frantz Fanon talked about this in terms of who am I, right? In an ontological sense. This encapsulates language, political institutions, and I think one of the ways that most urgent way we respond to the question, who am I, is through a name. And so what happens when that name is not even one that I would recognize, or my grandparents or great-grandparents would recognize as belonging to our family, right? Now, we shouldn't exaggerate too much because the Algerians retain control over certainly what's in French is now the prénom, which is an adaptation of the ism from the Arabic name. Families confer this, parents, grandparents, the family decides upon the name of a baby. The patronym, in theory, the second name, in theory, Algerians, when they're first assigned this, get to choose this, right? And this is the French laws is clear about this. They want Algerians to have the choice of a patronym, but in many cases they don't. In many cases they don't.
And can we consider the restoration of indigenous names and memory an act of decolonization and national rebirth?
Yeah, so what happens after 1962? What happens when the Algerian people is sovereign and has its own state? Where does the questions of names intervene in this point? Now, I think that this is a question for the Algerian people and its representatives to decide on this own, because it is a question of sovereignty. And I'm coming from the outside. I'm very much aware that I'm coming from the outside, so I'm not here to say what should and should not be done. I think one of the things that comes out of my research is a cautionary tale. And this is a cautionary tale about the way that we understand names in the 21st century, which is often in terms of a sovereign sign of the individual, that this expresses something deep about this, and that I have some control over the name. And if we look at history, attitudes are always changing, right? Everything's in flux. We shouldn't think that we can go back to some primordial time when things were perfect and so forth. But certainly in terms of history, the name is a sign that embeds one's in a society, within a family. It belongs to people in the street. It belongs to your parents, your grandparents, your aunts and uncles, your cousins, and so forth. rather so much that it's defined, it finds itself. And then we should also understand that words themselves shift in meaning over time, right? Names that we might think today are prejudicial, might have a hidden history that when they were originally coined, and in many cases at the end of the 19th century, that this was an esteemed name, right? And so I think that's also, we have to be cautious in this, right? It's not so much we go back to an originary past and try to extract something from the past and we can bring this into the present to make us whole again. I think it's knowing the history of all of this is the most important thing.
Professor, you also wrote about violence under colonialism, and that it wasn't limited to warfare. It was administrative, symbolic, and linguistic. So how can Algerians and international audiences better understand this everyday form of violence that sought to erase rather than only to conquer?
Yeah, so that's a good question, and it's a big question. And I would say in terms of, let me take one part of it. You talked in terms of the international importance, right? The global importance of Algerian history and the Algerian experience and its past, and how this reflects in larger questions of the world. And certainly I think that the question of naming is not unique to Algeria. Many people are renamed, and many times over during the course of modern name reform. I come from a country that historically has valued immigration, and people when they come to, I'm talking about beginning of the 20th century, late 19th century. My maternal grandfather, for example, came from Austro-Hungary, which is today Croatia, and they were the name that my branch of the family in the United States has is slightly different than the branch of the family whom I know in Croatia. Right? There's an adaptation of the name for American norms, and so it could facilitate, make it easier. The idea is of assimilation. And so I think that this is something slightly different. Not every case of renaming necessarily, although it's loaded with the possibility, necessarily means a case of alienation and symbolic violence. Right? When a name serves to open, and when the people who bear this name have some agency over how it's used, I think that that's important. And most certainly the sort of work that it has done. Right? We could go on and talk about the experience of people coming to the United States and the way they're renamed, which is often a very violent thing. And one of the things that they're trying to do when they make my grandfather's name more familiar to American audience is they're trying to extract labor from these people. Right? These are people who came. The reason they're allowed into the country is because they're workers. They'll work cheap. The understanding is that they will work without striking, and the name is a part of that. Right? So. It's always important, I think, just to be careful about it and do the research and look at it from many different angles.
Algeria continues to recover and preserve colonial archives, so documents that testify to both oppression and resistance. From your research, which types of records are most vital for protecting historical truth and confronting attempts to rewrite the past?
Yeah, thanks for that question. The question of a colonial archive is a delicate one, because the reason why it was produced was for precisely these sorts of things that I've been talking about. This is not a neutral archive. And when you go into the boxes of French-produced records, they're there to tell their own story. Right? They have a story that they want to tell. That's why they've been preserved. That's why they're archived and we have access to them today to tell their own story. And so this is in many cases you have to be careful as a researcher to not get drawn into that story too much, right? Because this is a story that, in terms of violence of colonialism, that we don't want to repeat in our own voice. And one of the things that I always try to do, and it's taken some time, I think, to do this, the power of the colonial archive is such that one really has to resist its interpolative capacity. And one of the things that I'm inspired by are novelists like Assia Jabar, right? The Algerian novelist, who was also a historian. I mean, I don't know if people know this, but she was also trained as a historian, and she was always looking for, and she writes about this with great brilliance, about people who were in the margins of this colonial archive. and she's able to extract them from the margins and make them meaningful, compelling characters in her novels. Now, certainly I don't have the capacity to do this. I wouldn't compare what I do to Assia Jabbar, but I'm inspired by her work, right? I mean, she showed us a way to work against this, and to, really what we're talking about is telling a story that makes sense to Algerian readers today, right? And that's one of the things that I want to do.
Yeah, and Professor, as Algeria marks the 71st anniversary of the revolution, what role do you see for scholars, Algerian and international, in transforming commemoration from ritual into a living form of knowledge that deepens understanding and reconciliation?
Yeah, well, I think the sort of dedication to knowledge that I see at the book fair here, SILA, is one way to think about this. We're not just talking about history, we're talking about literature, we're talking about sciences, social sciences, hard sciences, all those sorts of things that are represented here. And that might be one way to think about the question. I mean, another way to think about it in terms of Algeria and the world is certainly, we talked about the example of the revolution itself, and the traditions that Algeria, particularly in the period after independence, when Algerians became, we know still we need more work on this, but we know something of the history of African Americans who came to Algiers in the 1960s and 1970s as political exiles, and the home that they found here. And that's an important story to tell. And so I'm thinking about trying to push that story back a little bit, even to the Second World War, when so many of the soldiers who were in Algeria, American soldiers who were in Algeria, are African American soldiers, right? There are tens of thousands of them. Over 15% of the military forces in Algeria in 1945 are African American troops. And so for these people who are coming from a country of racism and Jim Crow and extreme violence, when they come here and they see they're wearing uniforms of the United States, but they're not free in that army. It's a segregated army. They aren't going to eating in the same table with white officers. They're commanded by white officers. They're giving meaningless tasks, drudge tasks, and so forth to do while they're here. What does that see when they look over the fence of the barracks and they see the Algerian population and the conditions in which they're suffering in under French colonial rule? And so trying to think about different sorts of synergies and possibilities of solidarity through these sorts of shared histories. And I think that that's it. I mean, one of the things that's inspiring about the Algerian Revolution, absolutely just to this moment today, with all that's happening around us, is this example, the 1st of November, of a movement that should have failed, right? Objectively speaking, it should have failed, but it surmounted, right? Leaders made decisions, they made wrong decisions, but they made many correct decisions, and they were victorious in the end. And, it's a sort of Herculean struggle against Goliath, right? Mm-hmm. And that's deeply inspiring for people who suffer under oppression today, absolutely.
Yeah, and if we go back to your book, A Desert Named Peace, the Sahara emerges not as a distant frontier, but as a central stage of conquest. How does integrating the Saharan story into the broader narrative of resistance enrich Algeria's national memory today?
Yeah, thank you. That's another thoughtful question. And when I started the book, did the research, so I was a PhD student, a graduate student, and I'm looking for a project. And when I talked about the conquest of the Sahara and the question of violence, people are saying, "Oh, but the French expansion of the Sahara was pacifique." I got this a lot from French researchers in particular. It was not marked by its violence, right? There was the idea of in French, the expression was the tache d'huile, right? This sort of like, so I go into the archives and I find that that's not at all the case. And I think that one of the things that, for example, I teach a course on North African history, a survey course that goes from 1500 to the present. And I start always with Algerian history south of the Sahara, right, the Sahel. And rather than starting with the Mediterranean and links to Europe, I try to emphasize the links to Africa. And I think that certainly the research I did on the book enables me to do this, but I think it's also an interesting way to to think about the history, not necessarily as always forcefully looking towards France, that French colonialism inevitable, that France has to be at the center of the story, but to decenter Europe from Algeria's history and think about, and the Sahara is a great place to do that work.
So briefly, Professor Benjamin, when Algeria's revolution is taught in schools, what core truths about colonialism and resistance should remain non-negotiable to ensure students grasp both the moral purpose and the historical reality of the struggle of independence?
When I tried to teach my students in the United States, I try to encourage them to think about different perspectives, to remain agile as thinkers and critical in their approach to the sources. And so I don't try to impose a vision that I have as a researcher. In many cases, I give them the sources and sources that they're able to deal with, that they're approachable, and ask them, how do we make sense of this? And then I try to, they'll have an initial reaction to this, and I say, okay, well, let's look at this in the historical context. We are historians, we're coming here to study history. Let's apply a historical lens to this and contextualize, why people are doing things. And, they're free to come to their own conclusions, right? And in many cases, what I find with this methodology is I learn things from the students, things in the sources that I hadn't seen. People, and I've been teaching now for several generations, and the approach for, the students are 20 years old, right? They come and they know Algeria, but maybe not well, they want to know more, and their questions change over time. Right? From 10 years ago, the questions today are much different, and it's always a process of learning. In other words, it's a very dynamic environment, and one in which even I as an instructor want to keep an open text, right? An open text that in some ways writes and rewrites itself over time.
So, Mr. Benjamin, thank you for your insight and your participation here with us today. Yes,
great, wonderful, thank you.
Dear viewers, we have reached the end of our interview for today. Please stay tuned to watch the next interviews. This was your host, Marwa Belaiwer. Thank you for watching.